For 15 years, Elias Thorne believed he was merely a man who had done a simple, decent thing. He was a widower working double shifts at the docks, living a life of calloused hands and quiet struggle, until the night he found Clara shivering under a bus stop awning.
It is too cold.
He did not know then that the small, frightened girl he brought into his home would one day be the only thing standing between him and the total destruction of the empire he built from nothing. He gave her his name, a bed, and a promise that in his house, no one would ever be left out in the cold. But as the years turned into a decade, the board of directors at Thorne Logistics began to view his integrity as an inconvenience. They saw a man who ate lunch with his drivers as a relic, a weakness to be exploited. They built a cage of false accusations, using the very girl he saved as the centerpiece of their betrayal, claiming he had drained the company to enrich her. It was a cold, calculated move to strip a father of everything he possessed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elias Thorne's journey into the world of freight was not born in a boardroom, but in a cramped, leaking garage where he spent his nights mapping out the inefficiencies that cost the industry millions. He saw the empty trucks and the idle storage units that the men in suits ignored, and he worked with a relentless, quiet focus to stitch those wounds closed. His son, Graham, and the girl who became his daughter, Clara, were there from the start, learning at the kitchen table that a business could be built on the strength of a handshake. By the time Thorne Logistics grew into a $900 million titan, Elias remained exactly who he had always been. He refused to trade his worn canvas jacket for an expensive suit, and he refused to move his office away from the docks where the real work happened. To the directors, this was not humility, it was a liability. They looked at the balance sheets and saw only the assets they wanted to seize. The man leading the charge against him was Julian Vane, a chairman who believed that influence was measured in the depth of one's pockets rather than the content of one's character. Vane watched Elias from behind a desk of polished mahogany, waiting for the perfect moment to execute a hostile takeover. He found his opening in an old military contract, manipulating the paperwork to make it appear that Elias had been funneled money into a private trust for Clara. It was a masterful deception. They forged signatures and falsified records, creating a narrative that painted Elias as a hypocrite who hid his greed behind the guise of charity. As the lawsuits began to arrive at his doorstep, the people who had once praised his rise started to turn. The news cycles were filled with headlines questioning his ethics, and the atmosphere in his own hallways turned icy with suspicion. Elias watched it all happen with the calm of a man who had weathered storms his entire life. He kept his silence, even when his son, Graham, urged him to fight back against the public vitriol. Elias knew that the truth was a slow-moving current, and he refused to panic. But the pain he felt was not for the money or the status. It was the way they turned his love for Clara into a weapon. They spoke of her as if she were a transaction, a line item on a ledger designed to prove his incompetence. When the summons arrived, giving him 72 hours before the final hearing, the house felt far too quiet. Clara had vanished. Her office in Washington was empty, her phone went to voicemail, and the silence began to stretch into a source of real agony. Elias started to wonder if the rumors were true, if the woman he raised had finally decided that a career was worth more than the man who had pulled her out of the rain all those years ago. While the world assumed Clara had abandoned him to save her own future, she was actually moving through the shadows of an old law office, searching for a ghost. She was hunting for the original founding trust documents, records that June Holloway, the loyal secretary who had stood by Elias for decades, had kept hidden away for exactly this moment. In a dusty records vault, Clara found the archival box. On the front, in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Clara, when the court asks who owns the promise." She sat on the cold floor and read the document until the sunlight faded from the windows. She realized that the fund wasn't a stash of stolen wealth, but a protective shield designed by Elias long before the company was famous, specifically intended to stop people like Julian Vane from ever succeeding in a coup. She was the guardian of the founding spirit. The day of the hearing arrived with a biting chill that mirrored the mood of the courtroom. Julian Vane and his high-priced legal team, led by a man named Arthur Sterling, walked in with the arrogance of victors. They presented a mountain of documents, using enlargements of Elias's signature to dazzle the judge. Sterling's performance was clinical. He systematically dismantled Elias's reputation, portraying him as a man who had let sentimentality rot his judgment. He turned to Elias and asked him if he had adopted a girl named Clara. When Elias answered yes, the gallery filled with a murmur of disapproval. Vane smiled from the back, certain that the trap had been fully set. The judge was moments away from issuing a preliminary order to freeze Elias's voting rights, a move that would have effectively ended his ownership of the company forever. The gavel hung in the air, suspended over the wooden block. Just as the judge began to move her pen, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom pushed open. Clara walked down the center aisle, dressed in a sharp, dark suit, carrying the leather portfolio that contained the history of their family's integrity. She did not look like the scared child from the bus station, nor did she look like the daughter who had been bought off. She stood before the clerk with a steady, unbreakable posture. She announced her presence as the counsel of record for the defense. The room went dead silent. Arthur Sterling stood up immediately to object, citing a conflict of interest, but Clara was ready. She turned the objection against him, pointing out that since they had made her identity the centerpiece of their accusations, she was now the most relevant witness in the entire case. The judge, visibly intrigued, allowed her to proceed with her emergency filing. Clara laid the original trust document on the stand. She walked the court through the clauses that explained exactly why the fund existed. It was not a bank account for her, but a corporate firewall. She showed how Elias had legally tied his founding principles to the company's survival, and how he had anticipated the exact kind of treachery that Vane was currently attempting. Then, she pulled out the letter. It was a handwritten note from the day her adoption had been finalized, formally incorporated into the trust as a statement of intent. When she read the words aloud, the courtroom felt different. It was no longer about money, it was about the moral weight of a promise. She explained that Elias had been protecting the company from those who would strip it for parts, and that the board's current actions had triggered a clause that transferred the voting authority to her. Sterling tried to dismiss the clause as expired, but Clara had the renewal filings, every one of them submitted on time by June Holloway. She called the secretary to the stand, and as June recounted how Julian Vane had deliberately buried those reports to avoid letting the other directors know the truth, the tide of the hearing shifted completely. Clara then moved to the digital evidence. She presented a series of internal messages between Vane and his conspirators, proving that the entire lawsuit had been a pre-planned heist. She showed the evidence of the payoff, the strategic advisory fee that was nothing more than a bribe. As the forensic analysis of the metadata was placed into the record, the cool, collected demeanor of the opposing counsel finally shattered. The judge demanded answers, and for the first time, the people who had claimed the moral high ground were scrambling for a way out. Clara stood at the podium and looked directly at the people who had tried to destroy her father. She didn't just defend him, she dissected their corruption with surgical precision. She proved that they had not only targeted Elias but had intended to betray every shareholder and every employee in the company to line their own pockets. When the judge issued her ruling, it was decisive. She stripped Vane of his position, ordered an immediate halt to the acquisition, and recognized Clara as the lawful protector of the founding voting authority. As the courtroom cleared, Elias and Clara met in the hallway. There were no grand declarations, only the quiet recognition of a circle that had finally closed. Elias asked her why she had stayed away, why she had let him suffer in that silence. Clara told him that she had learned from the best, that she knew how to find the back door to a trap when the front one was barred. She handed him a small, cold object, the house key he had given her when she was 9 years old. It was the symbol of everything they had been through. He took the key and placed it in his pocket, feeling the weight of it against the canvas jacket that had seen him through every struggle of his life. The empire was saved, the predators were in retreat, and the legacy was secure. But as they walked out into the afternoon air, the only thing that mattered to either of them was the fact that the promise had been kept. Through the rain and the legal battles and the silence, they had remained a family, standing together against the world, ensuring that no matter how hard the storm blew, no one was ever left outside again.